Hi, my name is Asia Shcherbakova, and I'm a co-developer of the Baseworks Method, and I will be your host for this transmission reflection today. The Baseworks Method is an approach to movement and physical practice that has a profound effect on perception and the quality of day-to-day and moment-to-moment experiences. And the Baseworks transmissions look at both concrete and abstract realizations that come up as a result of commitment to any type of practice or pursuit to achieve life goals. And our goal here is to come up with common vocabulary to better describe these experiences and outcomes. And transmission reflections is a format that allows us to reflect on what was discussed during the transmission conversations, digest it, and perhaps even come up with some new perspective on what has unfolded during the talk. This is a reflection on the conversation between Patrick Oansi and Jozef Frucek in the transmission episode Jozef Frucek on fighting monkey practice, communication, and adaptation of biological systems. It would make the most sense to first watch or listen to that episode, and you can find the link to that episode in the show notes. I'd like to point out for our listeners that Fighting Monkey is a project co-founded by Jozef Frucek together with Linda Capitania, but since we only had Jozef on the transmission conversation, we will focus on him. Fighting monkey is an important phenomenon in the movement education landscape, and not just because of the training approach, but also because of the rich narrative surrounding it. Soon after releasing that episode in March, Jozef came to teach in Montreal, and Patrick and I attended his lecture at the dance faculty of Concordia University. And after the lecture, we spoke with another attendee who was a flamenco instructor, and he said that he attended specifically because it's always interesting to hear how people talk about dance and movement beyond just the technique. So this shows that the way Jozef talks about fighting monkey broadens the conversation about the role of movement practices in the broader context of life. And rather than focusing on what you would do in Fighting Monkey, we would like to know how Jozef chooses to talk about it. And this reflection will be mostly based on the content of the transmission episode with Jozef, but just occasionally I will also be referring to the content of that lecture. We'll center on three keywords: communication, being yourself, and the relationship between being yourself and being a teacher. So this reflection will consist of roughly three parts. 1. Examining thinking behind the structure of the fighting monkey practice. 2. Reflecting on why Jozef chooses to frame fighting monkey the way he does. And 3. Exploring whether we can draw any meaningful comparisons with Baseworks. First of all, I'd like to highlight one important moment. Jozef talks a lot about communication in this episode. However, for our audience, it would be helpful to differentiate the conventional meaning of this word and the way Jozef uses it. Because in most cases, when he says communication, he means much more than just verbal communication or even nonverbal communication or interaction. Instead, he uses this word to refer to the entire interaction between you and the environment. For example, when he says that 0 forms explore the effects of your communication on your physiology, it's not about verbal exchanges with people, but about how you interact with the world, how you walk, how you move, how you eat, sleep, and what you do, and how you interact with people as well. So with this point in mind, let's move on. To start, let's review one of the key concepts that Jozef relies on conceptualizing the fighting monkey practice, which is Karl Friston's free energy principle. In basic terms, this principle explains how biological systems, including humans, maintain their existence by minimizing the amount of surprise or prediction error. While it may seem that we just perceive the world around us as is using our senses, this is actually not the case, because it would be too overwhelming to constantly perceive all the incoming sensory information. So we can think of our brain as a prediction machine. It constantly models the world around us, making predictions about what will likely happen next based on our past experiences, and it compares it with the sensory input. And in Friston's model, we have two components, me and the world, which are linked in this way. Me is your inner world, including your thoughts and feelings, memories, skills, and bodily states. And the world represents everything external, your environment, social interactions, and physical challenges. And you constantly predict what the world is likely going to be. And when your sensory input from the world doesn't match your internal model, your brain notices this mismatch or discrepancy. And this mismatch is what Friston calls free energy. So it's the uncertainty or surprise experienced by the organism. And the central idea is that living organisms are constantly trying to optimize or minimize the amount of surprise and maintain the homeostasis, which is the dynamic balance of the internal environment. How can you minimize the surprise? You can either update the model to better reflect reality, which is learning, or you can take actions to change your environment to better fit the model. So this continuous loop of perceiving, predicting, and acting is what helps you to stay aligned with your world, ensuring your survival and well-being. And I think the idea of learning here is pretty clear, but if you're wondering how exactly can we change the world to minimize the surprise, in the language and logic of this model, we eat to minimize the surprise of hunger, and we put on clothes to minimize the surprise of being cold. And as you can imagine, in this particular case, changing your model to "I'm not cold" would not be very effective. But in many cases, it is possible to use one strategy over the other. And always choosing action would be an example of rigid thinking, trying to force the world to your beliefs. But always choosing to refine your model will result in indecisiveness, procrastination, and inaction. And Jozef talks about how fighting monkey is a practice that helps to be more intelligent and flexible in balancing these two strategies. You can learn more about Friston's model in this book, and I'm also going to add a few links to the show notes to a couple of Friston's open access papers about this model as it applies to behavior, consciousness, learning, and so on. Now let's review how Jozef extends Friston's model, which can be seen as the philosophical backbone of the fighting monkey practice. Jozef takes the fundamental idea of perception-action loops from Friston and adds two fighting monkey components to it: zero forms and movement situations. And if you think that you're here right now, then zero forms focus on understanding your state from past to present, while the movement situations model the world from present to future. And this is how Jozef explains zero forms in the conversation. Zero forms are a set of physical questions where we study the effect of your communication on your physiology. So we keep your hypothesis of the world and we test it through interoception and proprioception. We try to test what's the effect of your everyday life on your joints, on your organs, on your mind. How do you coordinate? What is your autobiography? What is your voice, etc., which makes you understand what information is missing. Why are you aging the way you're aging? Zero forms practices include stillness, joint articulations, coordinations, improvisation, and voice training. But zero forms are not just about physical practice. Using a format of one question per one type of practice, Jozef summarizes it like this. Zero forms are questioning who you are. What is your autobiography for stillness? What is the state of your viability for joint articulations? How do you coordinate for coordinations? How do you move and improvise for improvisation? And how do you express yourself for voice training? Fighting monkey does include stillness practices in a more conventional sense, but for example, would standing with your arms out for 60 minutes be considered a stillness or joint articulations practice under this classification of zero forms? When I hear Jozef talking about it conceptually, I get a feeling that he refers to something less physical. But whichever way, these zero forms practices are inserted into Friston's model between me and perception and are meant to facilitate change in perception to better fit the environment. And then Jozef explains movement situations like this. And between perception and action, we have added another element, which we call movement situation, which means simulation of life, which is basically your capacity to model the world before you meet the world. What does that mean? It means that a basketball player does training before he goes to play a basketball match. You're basically able to model what you would like to do in the future. And are you able to model various futures so you can create different hypotheses from which you can choose the best strategies? So what you learn in movement situation is your capacity to model the world in a different way. So then you can have a larger repertoire to act in the dynamic world. Now, just from this explanation, it may sound like he's talking about skill training. However, the practices included here, they don't really look like typical movements you would see in sports or dance or martial arts. They're more like games and often involve a partner. The way I understand this is that in movement situations, Fighting Monkey introduces elements of unpredictability, such as another person or some unconventional movement tasks to prepare you for the unexpected, allowing you to develop a repertoire of responses that you can later use in the future in real-life situations which are unpredictable. At the lecture, Jozef mentions that the practices that are included in movement situations include scripts, body-body, composition, and sculpture. So this conceptual model of the Fighting Monkey practice fits very neatly within Friston's model. And Jozef says that this structure of practice is meant to be a life-supporting practice. And saying life-supporting, he doesn't talk simply about health or injury prevention. So let's take a look where Jozef draws his inspiration from when he talks about life. When Patrick asked Jozef how he felt about following the rules while playing basketball, Jozef responded like this. The basic rules that we need to obey are those rules that are common to all biological systems. And what is common to all biological systems, all living creatures, is that we try to persist. And we try to resist dissipation of energy. We try to create what Francisco Varela would call autopoiesis. We are autopoietic systems, self-creating systems. An autopoietic system has a certain autonomy from the external environment and tries to keep its function and its structure intact for at least a certain amount of time in order to persist in a fluctuating external environment. So that's kind of the first rule. I try to maintain my stability. I try to maintain my boundaries. So we'll talk a little bit about homeostasis and autopoiesis next, but first talking about living systems, let's focus on the phrase, I try to maintain my stability, I try to maintain my boundaries. This is a reference to a list of properties of living systems. If you study biology, something like this usually comes up in an introductory lecture on the origins and definitions of life. And when we think about this stuff, we usually imagine not complex organisms like humans, but simple cells. And the earliest forms of life were just these, cells floating in the ocean. And a cell is essentially a bag of water separated from the other water by a membrane. So Jozef lists the following properties of living systems, and I'm not sure where the source of this particular list is coming from, but overall it makes sense. So living systems can be characterized by the following properties. They have a boundary, they are capable of movement, they are responsive, which means that they can react to the changes in the environment. They are capable of digestion and assimilation, taking stuff they need from the external environment. They have metabolism, they excrete stuff they don't need, they grow, and they reproduce. Of course, these properties of living systems are applicable not only to single-celled organisms, but also to humans. And when Jozef says that a life-supporting practice is supposed to support all these features of life, he's obviously not talking about it literally. Jozef uses this list more metaphorically. And while the original list talks about more material stuff, like taking in nutrients to grow in this exchange between the living system and the environment, Jozef focuses more on information and modes of interaction. And as mentioned above, he refers to this as communication. Jozef didn't go into the details of this list in the podcast, so I'm taking it from the lecture. And since it wasn't in the podcast, I won't go into details. But for example, in a more metaphorical sense, your boundaries are not just your skin, but who you are and how you distinguish yourself from the world. And talking about movement, Jozef highlights that the movement should fit your phenotype. What I found the most interesting in Jozef's interpretation of this list is that growth means innovation and reproduction means communication and sharing. And I'm going to return to this particular point later when I talk about Jozef's pedagogical stance. Now, going back to the question about the basketball rules, where Jozef switched to talking about the biological rules instead, of course, he mentions homeostasis. So he says, there is this rule that cannot be ignored. we're trying to maintain our homeostasis, our very narrow range of viability. And then within that very narrow range of viability, within this very constrained phenotype, the body type that we have, or our phenotypical construct, we try to create a maximum of freedom. And one of the freedoms would be maybe to express it, let's say, through basketball. So Jozef has this evolutionary perspective where he sees human culture and civilization as the extended phenotype of our species, like birds make nests and humans play basketball. But ultimately, it is all driven by the same forces, following the same natural laws. Obviously, when we say we are trying to maintain our homeostasis, we're not having it as our explicit goal because we have no direct conscious control over our homeostasis. But we can sense the effects of disrupted homeostasis. So things like pain, exhaustion, fatigue, thirst, hunger, inflammation, bleeding, calcification around the joints, even boredom, and ultimately death are all visceral signs of disrupted homeostasis, and they push us to do something about it and ultimately constrain us. So there are two types of constraints that Jozef talks about that ultimately drive our behavior. The internal constraints, which is maintaining our homeostasis, and the external constraints, which is coping with the environment and minimizing the amount of surprise. And then he poses a question that he's trying to answer for himself and within the fighting monkey practice. We need to maintain the homeostasis. We need to stay alive. And then within the cultural life that we live, we try to excel in different types of rules that are imposed on us. And the question is, are you an animal that is capable of bringing more understanding into the principles and then be more flexible in your behavior? Or is your behavior more rigid and creates more conflict with the world? So this question of flexibility and adaptability seems to be one of the central questions that determines your success in the fighting monkey practice. And then if we loop back a bit to where Jozef contextualizes the zero forms and the movement situations, he says, when we say that adaptive systems try to maintain their viability to stay within the range of certain homeostasis, what they're essentially doing basically is that they try to engage with the world through some kind of perception action loop. That's how we control the environment. The better you control the environment, the better you're able to reduce the complexity of the environment, the higher are the chances of your survival, the better you can play with what surrounds you, basically. And from there, he goes on to talk about zero forms and movement situations in the Friston's model. So I will talk about the perception action loops later, specifically in relation to our approach in Baseworks. But here I'd like to finish the summary of the conceptual framework behind the fighting monkey practice by returning to the concept of autopoiesis. So the concept of autopoiesis is last thing that we're looking at in that response to Patrick's question about the basketball rule. So I'll repeat. We are autopoietic systems, self-creating systems. An autopoietic system has certain autonomy from the external environment and tries to keep its function and its structure intact for at least a certain amount of time in order to persist in a fluctuating external environment. So this concept of autopoiesis was developed by biologists Maturana and Varela. From Greek, autopoiesis means self-creation. And the concept describes the nature of living systems to continuously produce themselves as a result of ongoing dynamic processes. So, for example, the processes of breathing, digestion, and elimination allow chemicals to essentially flow through our body. And if you were to Google or ask AI about molecular turnover, you will discover that almost all the molecules in our bodies, with the exception of our DNA, turn over in a matter of days, weeks, or at the most a few months, which means that at any point of time, we consist of molecules largely different from a month ago, but still there's a certain continuity of ourselves. But again, Jozef focuses on a much more metaphorical and information-oriented interpretation of autopoiesis. And it's not super unique to talk about autopoiesis in the context of movement. For example, I will link in the show notes to an article which uses the concept of autopoiesis to discuss creativity in dance. But what's interesting in how Jozef uses this concept is that for him, it's not just dance that is creative. I mean, dance is traditionally seen as a form of activity that requires a certain amount of creativity. But for Jozef, self-creation is about how you function in the world in a much broader sense, how you express and create yourself in the world. And this interpretation, again, resonates with Karl's Friston's model, where we have me against the world. So from all these frameworks that Jozef uses and creatively reinterprets, we can get the sense that Fighting Monkey doesn't just look at the organism in isolation, but instead looks at how an organism exists and tries to persist in the world, how it acts in it, adapts to it, responds to it, and takes the best out of it. Therefore, positioning Fighting Monkey against other practices, Jozef is constructing this category of life-supporting practice. So this is how he talks about it, and keep in mind what I said earlier about how he uses the word communication. So he says, I'm interested in creating a life-supporting practice. That's my main interest. Life-supporting practice is a practice that allows you to communicate better in the world and in the context in which you operate. So the main theme is a quest for better communication. Can you communicate better? Can you be better at exchanging information with the environment that surrounds you, on which your autonomy depends? And then he talks about how this compares with other practices and why not every practice is a life-supporting practice. So he says, any system that supports life needs to be capable of giving you feedback on where you are. If it cannot give you feedback, it's not a good system. Now, the question would be not yoga, not Tai Chi, not Pilates, not Feldenkrais, not Alexander technique, not stretching this or that, but do you have the grammar? Do you have the understanding of how to sample your internal states? Can you understand what kind of physiological state you're in? Are you capable of understanding what kind of autobiography you create? What is your territory? So, although Fighting Monkey is a movement practice, and the majority of people who participate in Fighting Monkey events or become long-term Fighting Monkey practitioners are mostly movers of some kind, we see that Jozef chooses to focus on such topics as understanding yourself, positioning yourself in time and in relation to everything in the world, and creating narratives. And to this, I'd like to add that in the lecture, he mentions that the ultimate aim of the Fighting Monkey practice is to become what he refers to as the actor of many roles. AMR, which is someone who can seamlessly switch roles and adapt to an ever-changing world. And although he's not using this particular acronym in the conversation, which was filmed months earlier than the lecture, he still talks about this concept. Like, he talks about someone who doesn't become loyal to one system. So while this part I quoted above about not yoga, not Tai Chi, not Feldenkrais, may sound like it's a critique of these practice systems, but I believe that what Jozef critiques is not the systems themselves, but the approach to engaging with them, seeing them as the ultimate answer to everything. And if we look at it from the perspective of the extended Friston's model, becoming too loyal to one system would mean to get stuck in the system when your model becomes too rigid. And then not only do you stop developing, but you may also get physically hurt. There's an interesting segment in the conversation where Jozef talks about working with athletes. To summarize, he says that professional athletes usually have their teams to support them anyway, and also being young, Jozef says, they do not have the time to sense themselves. They are young enough to overcome whatever obstacles. They will be dealing with the troubles when they finish their careers, and that's the time to come to us. Now, this sounds very spot on, and at the same time, it's just fascinating that this is the way it is. This topic also came up in the conversation with Maria Lucia, and of course, we hear it over and over that people like athletes and dancers often have to learn how to slow down and adapt the practice as they grow older, and this is not something that is part of their curriculum. But then again, maybe it's really not the responsibility of their training institutions to teach them that, right? So maybe it's too early to teach, for example, a 10-year-old about arthritis and retirement plans. So in this sense, there seems to be utility in the Fighting Monkey philosophical framework in a way that it can be abstracted from Fighting Monkey tasks specifically and applied to other practices. As Jozef says, if it doesn't give you feedback, it's not a good life-supporting practice. But we know that many people learn to derive feedback from their Tai Chi, yoga, martial arts, and so on practices. And in Baseworks, we also certainly constantly emphasize this aspect, and the entire logic of progression in the Baseworks practice is a non-stop ongoing feedback loop. On a micro level, the micro movements are all about feedback. And on a macro level, we don't tell you what to do, but you have to decide what's appropriate for you at any given moment. Also, looking at how people express the significance of fighting monkey for them personally, beyond strictly speaking movement-specific outcomes, a common pattern you see is that people say that fighting monkey has taught them to be more comfortable with uncertainty, discomfort, and frustration.
So if you've resonated so far with any of the topics discussed, please consider sharing it with others and clicking the like button. This is really going to help more people find it and support all the efforts that go into this production. Your being here to check out this episode today is a massive contribution toward the sharing of ideas that unfold in these talks, and thank you very much for your support. And subscribe to get real-time notifications about all upcoming episodes.
Now, in some ways, Fighting Monkey is not unique in offering that because there's so many environments where you can expose yourself to uncertainty and discomfort, basically by just doing something new. Or, when people say that they are frustrated with the Fighting Monkey coordinations, this is also not unique to Fighting Monkey because you could just go to a dance class taught by a detail-oriented teacher and try to learn a choreography that is unfamiliar to you, and you will experience something very similar. But what Fighting Monkey does is that it offers tasks with no clear goals. So you have to formulate your own goals, and this is essentially the modification of existing models. In Baseworks, we have certain ideas which parallel this approach. We do use the term movement task, where we are very explicit about the motor goals, like what you need to move and where. But the meaning of the movement is something that you have to figure out on your own, and people tend to discover different meanings in the same movement based on the context of their lives and other activities. Also, the quality of frustration in Fighting Monkey may be very different from what you might experience in Baseworks. In Fighting Monkey, the frustration typically comes from not being able to cope with a task. And in Baseworks, on the other hand, because we always moderate the intensity of any physical and cognitive process to make it more manageable, we don't have that frustration, but some people may experience frustration from not being allowed to do things in the way that they're used to. Talking about his younger years, Jozef says, "I always wanted to be an actor because I was fascinated that I could create a world that does not exist. I can create a world that I like, and I don't have to just sit, be passive, and receive the world that someone dictates for me. I can create new text. I can create new ideas that haven't been there before." And then he speaks about how he was aware of two different streams that complemented each other. On one hand, he wants to create his own world, but on the other hand, he wants to have the capacity to understand the rules and excel in the environment that is governed by those rules. So he leaves sports, he goes to art school, where he wants to study everything: acting, script writing, design, cinematography. And he says, "I wanted to learn absolutely everything. I wanted to know how to act so that I can be anyone in the world. I wanted to be skilled in how to pretend." But then he meets his mentor, who was a voice trainer or communication trainer, and she tells him, "You really only need to learn one thing. That is how to sound as yourself." And when Jozef explains what communication is, he expresses it in the following question: "Are you able to express yourself with a voice that belongs to you, so that you do not pretend or assume you have a certain role in life, but you are more you? You are more authentic to yourself." And he also adds that this whole line of thinking was a major contribution to developing of the entire Fighting Monkey practice or research, right? So we arrive at this question about authenticity. That comes up a lot in transmission conversations. We had Ryan Hurst, who talked about how he had to give up who he was in order to really learn martial arts. And then we just released another conversation with Maria Lucia Agon Ramirez, where she's been very articulate about how one of the most important aspects of her activities is to provide spaces for other people to be authentic. And so here we have Jozef Frucek's take on authenticity. When Patrick asks Jozef what he means exactly when he says that he's learned to sound himself, Jozef explains that sounding yourself or being yourself is When you coordinate, when you move, when you play basketball, when you do boxing, wrestling, and if you do it right, it looks right, it sounds right. If you speak and you do not lie, it has a beautiful tonality, it has beautiful music, it has beautiful variations. As soon as you start to lie to yourself, there is this rigidity being introduced. So it's interesting how he transforms from I want to learn how to pretend to I want to express myself in a way that I don't lie. And it's not necessarily contradiction because changing your behavior according to your environment is not necessarily a lie, but it may be adaptation or flexibility. And someone who can do that can be called AMR, the actor of many roles. So then he continues. So being authentic to yourself is to have the capacity to intelligently change the hypothesis about the world or slightly change the action about the world in order to minimize the errors that you are creating. So he explains authenticity through Friston's model, but then he continues like this. So someone who sounds as himself is someone who doesn't become loyal to one idea, doesn't become loyal to one system, doesn't become loyal to, oh, this is what I stand for and I'm never going to change it. Or this is how I'm going to act in this world and this is the right way. Sounding well is being humble and understanding that the world is fluctuating. You're fluctuating. You cannot have one answer to the world. Whatever that would be, maybe yoga, tai chi, boxing, jiu-jitsu, wrestling, it doesn't matter. You need to really interact with the world, and the world itself is our feedback. And from every single encounter in the world, we have the opportunity to learn. World is for us and the greatest playground to learn and improve our hypothesis of the world or our actions in the world. Jozef connects the idea of being authentic or sounding yourself with the goal of fighting monkey, to be able to intelligently update your model of the world and adjust actions accordingly. So from this, it seems to logically follow that either fighting monkey should teach you to be more authentic, or that fighting monkey is Jozef's practice of being authentic. And I think Jozef is aware of this tension because he explicitly says that it would be horrible if his students simply imitated what he did. And I quote, "What I'm interested in and what is really becoming my personal motivation is, can I share knowledge with my students in such a way that they can become independent from me? That once they learn these principles, that they will be able to create their own poetry because they understand the grammar. If they understand the grammar, they can create their own thing. They do not have to rewrite the same book I wrote." And then in another segment, he says a very similar thing. "That's what I'm interested in, being able to inspire you, to move you, maybe inspire you to do something else or look at the world in a different way. My PhD is in communication, and the fighting monkey is basically about how can we communicate better." So it seems clear that Jozef finds it important to be authentic, to communicate better with the world, to write his own script, to become the actor of many roles. And it also seems that he wants his students to be able to also achieve that. And I know that it's Jozef's position that he has no intention to convince unconvinced people about what he's doing because he has enough people coming to him to work with him. And so he mentions it in the conversation like this. "What I'm sharing with you is my creative thinking and my thought process in trying to understand how I analyze science or how I apply certain information from science or how I apply creativity into life, etc., but not repeating what I'm doing." And then he also shares that among pragmatic and epistemic actions, he personally is more interested in epistemic actions. He's interested in exploration for the sake of exploration. If he has a good solution, he wants to find a better one. And when people come to him asking whether he can help increase their performance, he says, "We can play together and try to find out if there would be any value in what we're doing to your life. And if not, then it's fine." So what I'd like to point out here is that epistemic concerns and drives are not necessarily a part of Friston's model. It predicts that if the environment is optimal, then there's no surprise, no discrepancy, and there's no need to change perception or attempt to change the environment. So while creativity and flexibility may aid adaptation, I'm not sure if becoming more in sync with the environment will automatically make you more creative within the context of Friston's model. So it almost sounds like fighting monkey is not about handling the mismatch, but about seeking mismatch, not about minimizing it, but about trying to maximize it, at least at first. Fighting monkey is a very unique entity. And as I said, I see a great value in generating philosophical frameworks and narratives around movement practices and their role in the broader context of life, because there must be pre-formulated goals for people to engage with movement practices beyond physical gains, rehabilitation, and relaxation. So we looked at how Jozef constructs this new category of life-supporting practice. This is very interesting for us because we also construct a lot of categories to talk about Baseworks, because existing categories don't always quite capture the essence of what we want people to understand. So for us, constructing new categories is a part of our educational process. I don't know how important it is for Jozef to be understood by his audience at this point. In Baseworks, we definitely want to be understood when we talk about movement experiences and outcomes, and doing these transmission conversations and reflections is a part of refining this process. We're trying to see which categories people use or construct to describe the results of commitment to their practices. Jozef mentioned that he's writing a book, so I'm assuming that he's working on clarifying his ideas to the point where they can be effectively shared to others, as this is the 8th feature of life. A life-supporting practice should be shareable. On the other hand, maybe there's no goal to make it fully transferable, and maybe Jozef is satisfied with it being something that inspires people to be more creative, curious, resilient, flexible, adaptable, and so on, like art. And as usual, we'll draw parallels with Baseworks. The common points would include the outlook that any practice or activity should be seen in the context of everything else you do in life, and that it is important to tune in and see how what we do affects how we feel. And in general, we would recommend anyone who's open to challenging their boundaries to attend a Fighting Monkey event to try it. We participated in Fighting Monkey events and we invited Jozef to Japan, so there's really a lot of affinity between our approaches. We obviously work with very different types of movements, so I'm obviously not going to compare the techniques themselves, but rather I will compare the frameworks that we use to conceptualize human behavior and how movement practice can be used as a medium to introduce change beyond the domain of physical movement. The first point would be about the balance and importance of structured learning. And this is related to a long-standing discussion between Patrick and Jozef over the years about the relative importance of linear and non-linear learning at different stages of skill acquisition. There is a lot of emphasis in Fighting Monkey practice on behavioral flexibility and adaptability. And if you go to a Fighting Monkey event, you will likely be doing very visceral things that you've never done before, which will leave you very stimulated and in an exhilarated state, and you may be sore for a few days. But if someone were to actually stick with the Fighting Monkey practice, there would be drills and repetition. And drills and repetition are generally needed to develop skills. So in this conversation, Patrick raises the point about linear and non-linear learning again, saying that there is a certain fundamental approach that you have to building the structure and coordinations, which is very linear, he says to Jozef. To which Jozef replies, I don't know what you mean by linear structure. So then Patrick stresses out that there are repetitive drills in Fighting Monkey practice that are linear. And then Jozef points out that if you look at an athlete, if they're not well coordinated according to their constitution, there's no performance. And Jozef says this is often pushed aside when the athlete has a problem and the athlete gets injured, he's sent to strength conditioning trainer or some kind of rehabilitation. But no one is really looking, and no one has time to look at how we coordinate in life, at his circadian rhythms, actions in relation to other people, speech, body coordination when running, or body coordination when working with an opponent on an athletic field. And then Patrick interrupts Jozef and says, wait a minute. But before that, the athlete has to go through drills and skill training. There's a lot of repetitive training to be done before one can innovate. And for context, in this long-standing discussion between Patrick and Jozef over the years, Patrick's position is that one needs drills and repetition for innovation and creativity to eventually stem out from that foundation of drills and repetition. And this is well captured in the martial arts concept of shuhari, and a different angle on it is the Fitz and Posner model of stages of learning that posits that before the autonomous phase, there naturally must be the associative, and prior to that, the cognitive phase. So when Patrick says that athletes always go through tons of drills and training, Jozef responds, and I'm going to quote, basically, we need to obey physics and biological rules, and we have a certain phenotype, a certain structure that we need to understand. Even within our phenotype, as human beings, there are differences that we need to incorporate in our training, and they have to be understood and nourished in some way. Once we understand the basics, we can harness what is given to us, the degrees of freedom that our body has, how we can harness energy, how we can transfer that energy through our bodies. It's like understanding grammar or understanding technique on piano. Once you get that, you can play whatever music in the world you like. I think this quote is very good for discussing the differences between Fighting Monkey and Baseworks approaches. The word basics sounds a little deceiving next to mentioning grammar and piano, especially if we talk about high-level performance. Yes, there are basic biological rules such as trying to survive and being a slave to your homeostasis. And yes, at some point, we have to consider holistic perspectives, and sometimes a small adjustment to a complex system can result in big changes. But in between, we have a shitload of skill building. And again, when we use the word skill in Baseworks, we don't only refer to specialized athletic skills, but we refer to any action that can be performed without much thought, planning, or effort. Grammar and piano techniques is not something that you understand, but something that you acquire through drills and practice. And also, even if you know grammar, you cannot necessarily freely express yourself without sufficient vocabulary. So what we hear is that Jozef wants to work with people who already have the vocabulary, that is certain skills. Or I don't know, maybe if he works with non-athletes, he's going to work with one movement vocabulary. And then if he's working with athletes, he will be working with a different movement vocabulary. In Baseworks, we put significant emphasis on investigating one's movement vocabulary and breaking down complex movements into smaller, more controllable chunks that can later be reassembled to perform more complex coordinations. We often work with people who can perform coordinated movements, but often fail to perform simpler isolated movements. Obviously, the application is very different. So again, I'm not comparing the methods. I'm only focusing on the importance of skill building in the framework. Both our methods use linguistic analogies, but the Fighting Monkey highlights the grammar, while we tend to focus on vocabulary. Now, moving to the next thing, talking about zero forms, Jozef says that zero forms practice makes you understand what information is missing. Once you know what information is missing, once you understand it better through sampling your internal state through zero forms, you can better understand then what the world is and what is the quality of your communication with the world. Once you know what information is missing, then you can change your perception, and by changing your perception, you are moving in the world in a different way. From a purely practical point of view, we actually interpret this part similar to how we think about it in Baseworks. Sometimes you are just not aware of what is missing. And you can use various practices to increase the sensory resolution. That will allow you to become more perceptive of the discrepancies and outcomes that you might not have noticed otherwise. And then finally, talking about the differences between our conceptual worldviews, what stood out to me the most was perception-action loops. So I'm not 100% sure whether Jozef is using the term perception action loop in only one sense or in more than one sense, but I'd like to bring the attention of our audience to the difference between at least two senses, because it is something that is very important in Baseworks. So what exactly is meant by perception action loop actually depends on the theoretical framework. And in Friston's work, particularly in the context of the free energy principle and predictive coding, the perception action loop is a part of a broader framework about how cognitive systems, like our brains, maintain a model of the environment to make sense of the incoming sensory information. And the perception action loop here is described through the lens of minimizing the prediction error. And in fact, if you really look at the diagram, the word perception here appears, strictly speaking, after the act of actual biological perception that has occurred and resulted in discrepancy. So rather than resonating with the environment, Friston's model emphasizes active modification of either internal states, the models, or the external states, which is choosing between actions to reduce the mismatch. Now, when I think about perception action loops in the context relevant in Baseworks, I think about motor function, learning, and radical embodied cognition. In this context, the perception action loop is the direct interaction between sensory input and motor output. So it's about real-time processing, where perception informs action and subsequent action modifies perception in this ongoing cycle. So it's like resonance or like real-time decision-making. So if someone asked us, how can we insert Baseworks into Friston's model? And believe it or not, nobody ever asked us this question, although it was actually very interesting to think about it. And this is why it's so interesting to do these transmission conversations and reflections. So if someone asked, how can we insert Baseworks into Friston's model? I'd say it would be very difficult because we focus on much more immediate real-time experiences. To coordinate something, you need separated coordinatable items, like actions, elementary actions. And we work on increasing the number of and awareness of these coordinatable items, hoping that people will find context for coordination, for example, by doing other movement practices. So that's in the movement domain. And in a more abstract decision-making domain, Baseworks increases one's awareness of the feedback from one's actions and also develops this stance that it is okay to personalize actions irrespective of what other people around are doing. So if Fighting Monkey is a quest for better communication, Baseworks is a quest for better perception. But because perception and action are seamlessly interconnected, better perception automatically leads to outcomes in action as well. When Jozef says that if a practice doesn't give you feedback, it's not a good practice, we agree with him with two clarifications. One is that if a practice doesn't give you feedback, you can change this by changing how you approach the practice. And this is where the Fighting Monkey philosophy may be very useful outside Fighting Monkey. And two, sometimes there's not enough feedback because there's not enough sensitivity, and this can be addressed through various practices, and Baseworks has this as its specific focus. If anything that you heard today resonated with you, please consider liking it or sharing it or subscribing to our channel or even leaving us a 5-star review. Your contribution helps us to reach more people with the content that we are sharing. If you have any ideas or comments that you would like to share with me or us, please send them to ideas@baseworks.com. To find out more about Jozef, Linda, and Fighting Monkey, you can check out their website at fightingmonkey.net or Instagram at fightingmonkey_practice. To benefit from exclusive content delivered right into your inbox, consider signing up for our newsletter from the footer on any page on our website. And to know more about Baseworks specifically and everything that we're doing, visit our website at baseworks.com.